Ever notice how when you're looking at research, especially in social science or education, there's almost always this question that pops up.
Hmm.
Did they control for SES?
Yeah, for sure.
It's like this major thing, this checkpoint. And today, we're going deep, deep into why that is. Why is that seemingly simple question so important?
Well, when researchers are trying to figure out, what influences things like how well kids do in school or different types of social behaviors, you have to look at socioeconomic status. You really have to consider it.
Hmm.
And typically when we say SES, we're thinking about three main things: how much money a family makes, their income, the parents' level of education, and what kind of jobs they have, their occupation.
Right, right.
Although, as we'll discuss, sometimes researchers will focus on just one or two of those things depending on, what their study's all about.
Yeah, and it's almost like this baseline now, isn't it? If you're reading a study and you see that they didn't control for SES, it's like a red flag. It's pretty much accepted now that studies that do account for SES, they're just seen as higher quality,
Oh, absolutely.
more reliable, more solid.
Yeah.
So why is that? What is the big deal about SES? Why is it such a key factor?
Well, there's a couple of big reasons. First off, SES is it's connected to so many other things. It's correlated with so many things. So think of it this way. You might see a link between something that seems totally random, like how many plates a family owns
Okay.
and how well their kids do academically.
Interesting.
Now, obviously, having more plates isn't going to magically make your kid a better student.
Right, you wouldn't go out and buy a whole new set of dishes thinking that's going to bump up your kid's GPA.
Exactly, exactly. But what the number of plates often reflects is a family's overall socioeconomic standing.
I see.
So families with higher SES might just have more access to the kinds of things that do directly help kids succeed in school. Things like maybe they have more books in the house, maybe they can afford to hire tutors, maybe they just have more stable home lives,
Yeah.
So that plate example, it really highlights how SES can be related to all these different variables and why it's so important to account for it. Otherwise, we might jump to the wrong conclusions about what's really causing what.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it's like a stand-in for all these other underlying factors.
That's right.
That could be really important. So what's the second big reason that researchers are so focused on SES?
Well, the second reason is a little bit more on the statistical side of things. SES very often accounts for a big chunk of the differences that we see in our studies.
Okay.
Sometimes a really large percentage. Think of it this way. You've got something called variance explained.
Mm-hmm.
That basically means how much of the differences we see in whatever we're studying can be accounted for by our model. And a higher percentage usually means a stronger model. So if you're building a model, a statistical model to understand something, and you find that when you include SES, it suddenly explains, a lot more of the outcome, well, that makes your model look a lot stronger statistically.
Right, right.
It's statistically powerful.
So you've got an example for this one too, right? Something about the weather.
Yeah. So imagine you're trying to predict what the average temperature is going to be in January for major cities in the U.S.
Okay, I'm following.
And you've got this model, and you're using things like how far north or south the city is, its latitude, how high above sea level it is, that's the altitude, and then how close is it to a big lake or an ocean.
Right.
And that model might explain, let's say, 80% of the temperature differences between these cities,
Okay.
which isn't bad. But then you realize that cities on the West Coast, like Seattle or San Francisco, they tend to be a lot milder than cities on the East Coast, even if they're at the same latitude.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So if you just add this really simple yes-no variable to your model for whether a city is on the West Coast, suddenly your model might explain 90% of the temperature variation.
Wow. Okay.
It significantly increases what we call the variance explained. And in a lot of ways, adding SES to social science models, it often has that kind of impact. It makes the statistical relationship seem a lot stronger.
Right, has a big effect.
Yeah.
But you hinted at a potential pitfall with that, right? What is that?
Well, the danger then becomes just automatically adding SES into every model just because it improves the numbers.
Right.
Without really understanding why it's having that effect.
Okay, yeah.
And this really leads us to the main thing we're looking at today. So while there are definitely advantages to controlling for SES in research, there's this growing debate about whether the way we typically do it is too simplistic.
Okay, yeah.
And it's interesting because it seems like researchers in the natural sciences are they're facing some similar complexities,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to this idea of reciprocal causality, the idea that sometimes cause and effect, it's not just a one-way street.
Interesting.
And also this fact that SES, it can feel like this huge, catch-all variable. It's like trying to stuff everything into one box.
Right.
So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to unpack these challenges. We're going to look at some of the more subtle ways that researchers are starting to think about this whole SES thing.
Okay, let's start with that catch-all idea.
Right.
So SES, it's not just about the numbers, is it?
Nope.
It's not just about the income, the years of schooling, the job title. It's tapping into something much deeper.
Exactly. Exactly. You got to think about the kind of person who gets to a certain level of, income and education and job status. It's not just those things on paper. It really reflects a whole mix of qualities that a person has. Human qualities. The source we're looking at today, it actually gives this really long list of these qualities. And it includes things like how hardworking is someone? How much do they persevere? Do they have determination? Do they have a passion for life? And, some people might even say it includes luck.
Wow. Okay.
And then you've got, what's their work ethic like? How good are their people skills, their communication skills? How materialistic are they? How good are they with investments? What was their family upbringing like? What's their family structure like now? Do they even enjoy reading? Do they value their family? How do they feel about learning?
That's a lot, yeah.
It's a big list. It's like, SES is the social science equivalent of, everything but the kitchen sink.
It really is. Yeah, and it kind of feels overwhelming when you lay it all out like that. So when researchers are just using those three standard measures, income, education, occupation, they're really simplifying this huge, complex picture.
They are. They're really simplifying it. And the problem with that is that, when we see SES having a big impact on something, like, let's say, how well kids do in school, our solutions tend to focus only on money or education.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we might say, okay, we need to increase funding for schools in low-income areas, or we need to give out more scholarships. And those things can be important. But we might be overlooking other crucial factors that are sort of bundled up in this big catch-all of SES.
Right.
Things like how strong the community networks are, or parental involvement that goes beyond just their education level, or even those internal things like a love for learning.
Yeah. It almost makes you wonder if sometimes we're just treating the symptoms and not the actual root causes, because our understanding of SES is so narrow.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, it's interesting because researchers in health and medicine, they've often been a little more willing to grapple with this complexity of SES. They're realizing more and more that SES isn't just a cause. It can also be an effect.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, think about obesity, for example.
Okay.
We know that someone's weight can definitely be influenced by their SES.
Right, like access to healthy food and all that.
Exactly. Access to healthy food, safe places to exercise, things like that. But research is also showing that obesity itself can actually impact someone's SES. Maybe because of health problems that limit their ability to work, or even because of social stigma and bias.
Oh, wow.
So it's like this two-way street. Obesity can affect SES, but then SES can also affect obesity.
Yeah, I get it.
And the source mentions this research from Stunkard and Sorensen back in '93 and Sobel in '94, who specifically looked at this.
Interesting.
Sobel even suggests that the direction of this, which one is causing the other, that it might even change over time.
Oh, wow.
And in a 1991 paper, he also argues that even various physical factors can have an influence on someone's SES. So this idea of SES being both a cause and an effect, it's something that hasn't really fully made its way into all areas of social science research.
It sounds like, the medical field is kind of ahead of the curve on this one. But the source also points out that even with this catch-all idea of SES, it still doesn't explain everything in social science research.
It doesn't. There are definitely findings that show that SES, it's not the only thing that matters.
Right.
For example, Hoffman and Johnson in 1998, they found that SES didn't really explain the link between family structure, like whether the parents were together, and teenagers using drugs. And Janes himself, he did this study in 1999 using a really large national data set, and he found that SES wasn't a big factor in explaining teenagers drinking alcohol.
Okay.
So these findings, they remind us that While SES is really important, there are other things going on. There are other family dynamics and social factors that we have to take into account.
Okay, so SES is this complex, multifaceted thing, and its relationship with other factors, it's not always so straightforward. It's not
Right.
just a one-way street.
Right.
So let's dig into that second challenge that you mentioned, the issue of causality. How do we figure out what's causing what when SES is involved?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. And again, this is something that medical and psychological fields have been looking at a lot. So the traditional view in a lot of social sciences has been that a parent's SES level has a direct impact on their kids' academic achievement.
Right, that makes sense.
Right. Like higher SES means more resources, better schools, more support at home. It seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that's kind of the common understanding.
Exactly. But there's this other argument, and it's gaining traction, that suggests that other factors might be more important,
Okay.
especially things about the parents themselves,
Okay.
their attributes, their qualities, and that these things might be the real reason behind both high SES and high academic achievement in their kids.
Hmm.
So think about parents who have a strong work ethic.
Okay.
There's research showing that they're more likely to pass that same work ethic on to their kids. And a strong work ethic could lead to the parents being successful in their jobs, which would lead to higher SES,
Mm-hmm.
but it could also lead to the kids being really diligent in their schoolwork, which would lead to higher achievement.
So the work ethic is the common thread there.
Exactly. So it's not that the parents' SES is directly causing the kids to do well in school.
I see.
It's that this other factor, this work ethic, is actually influencing both.
Okay. Yeah.
The source mentioned some research from the 90s, Elson and others, and Patty and Dash, that sort of supports this idea.
It's interesting.
And it's the same with parents who really value education.
Okay.
They're more likely to make sure their kids get a good education, which could lead to higher SES for the kids later on.
Right.
But it also means those kids are probably going to be more motivated to learn themselves.
Right.
So again, the parents' values are the driving force behind both things.
Mm-hmm.
And if we just look at SES as this predictor of how well kids will do, we're missing those crucial underlying things about the parents.
Right, like their values, their
Yeah.
work ethic, all those things.
Exactly. It's like, we're looking at the shadow, but not the object that's casting the shadow.
That's a great way to put it.
And psychologists have gotten in on this too.
Oh, yeah, that.
They've been looking at the family dynamics behind SES itself.
Okay.
So for example, Gerald and Bailey, they looked at families with low SES who were referred to psychiatric centers.
Hmm.
And they were trying to understand what was going on in those families that might have contributed to their low SES.
I see.
Marmot and his colleagues, they highlighted what they call psychosocial factors that link low SES and health problems.
Okay.
And then you've got Pasiga, who actually said we need to separate physical causes from social causes.
Mm.
And he suggested that SES itself, it's actually a product of lots of different social things.
So again, it's more complicated than just looking at the numbers.
Exactly. Exactly. And it seems like even our own perspectives as researchers can play a role in how we understand these relationships.
Yeah.
Well, the source talks about how our academic training and the research methods that we use can actually influence the way we think about cause and effect.
Interesting.
So Gibbon and Palmer, they found that the kind of education someone gets, it can shape how they explain social problems.
Okay.
And then Guth and Schrecker, they argue that the research method itself often kind of dictates what conclusions we draw about causality.
Right.
And then you've got Cooper and Hedges, who point out that the way a study is designed, specifically whether it accounts for other things that might influence SES,
Yeah.
it can really change the results.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And it doesn't stop there. You've got Schwetter, who warns us not to be too quick to assume we know what's causing what.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Friedman, who warns that a researcher's own biases and assumptions can actually skew the findings.
It sounds like there's this need for, real critical thinking when it comes to these assumptions about what's causing what.
Oh, absolutely. And researchers in psychology, they're really starting to acknowledge this. They're saying it's really hard to be sure about the direction of causality. And they're realizing how easily our assumptions can bias the results.
Right.
McLaren even used stress as an example,
Okay.
because stress could be both a cause and an effect of other things.
Yeah, I can see that.
And when it comes to SES specifically, there are studies, like CC and Williams, who looked at how intelligence can impact someone's income. And then you've got Hofstadter and his colleagues, who looked at how knowledge about culture and politics can actually influence SES.
Hmm.
And those studies suggest that SES can often be the result of other things, not just the cause.
Yeah, that totally flips the script.
It does. And this whole issue of causality, it gets even more complex when we look at specific areas of research like divorce.
Divorce.
Yeah, this is a really clear example of how the way we control for SES can have a big impact on what we find.
Yeah.
So in most studies that look at how divorce affects kids, they control for SES by using the custodial parent's current SES level.
Right. Which makes sense, I guess. You want to know the family's current economic situation.
Right. It seems logical at first. But the problem is, as Allison and Furstenberg pointed out way back in 1989, divorce often leads to a drop in income.
Right, of course.
So if you're controlling for SES after the divorce, you might actually be accidentally controlling for some of the negative financial consequences of the divorce itself.
Oh, I see.
And that could lead you to underestimate the true impact of the divorce on the kids.
Yeah, okay.
Milne, also in '89, put it this way. He said controlling for SES in this situation can remove variation that's actually due to the father being absent.
Right.
But it's being mediated through SES.
Yeah.
So in other words, the father's absence leads to lower income, which then impacts the kids.
So you're kind of masking the real effects of the divorce itself.
Exactly. It's like the control variable is absorbing some of the effect that you're trying to measure.
Right, right.
And this has led to this whole debate among researchers about the best way to control for SES in divorce studies. Some people argue that you should use the family's SES level before the divorce.
Okay, yeah.
You know, what was their economic situation before things changed exactly. And then there's Crane in '96, who found that the influence of SES can be overestimated if you don't consider other family factors that might be playing a role.
Right.
And Dornbush and Wood, they found that social processes had less of an impact on kids when family factors were controlled for.
Okay.
Although they admitted that it's really hard to fully account for all those complex family dynamics.
Yeah, of course.
And this whole challenge of figuring out what comes first, the chicken or the egg, the cause or the effect, it's not unique to SES.
Right.
We see the same debates in other areas of social science. Like there's this whole thing about the relationship between self-concept, how you see yourself, and academic achievement.
Interesting.
So for years, researchers thought that self-concept was a major driver of how well kids do in school.
Yeah.
But then research started showing that the relationship was way more complicated
Okay.
because academic achievement could also influence self-concept.
I see.
So it became this big question of which one was causing the other.
Right, right.
And similarly, there are studies about SES that didn't really consider this.
Yeah.
Could it be the other way around? Or could there be other things at play?
Okay.
Like Butler's work on causal attributions.
Yeah.
And Lowry and others' research on risky health behaviors.
So this takes us back to that idea of reciprocal causality that you mentioned earlier. And this seems to be getting more attention in medical research.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Adelman and his colleagues, they really focused on this term. They were saying that two variables can have this back and forth relationship where they're constantly influencing each other.
Okay, yeah.
So think about intelligence and SES again.
All right.
It makes sense that higher intelligence might lead to more education, better jobs, and therefore higher SES. But then, being in a lower SES environment could limit someone's access to things that help develop intelligence.
Right.
So they're both affecting each other.
It's like a loop, right?
Exactly. It's like a feedback loop. And Kaufman and Cooper, they emphasize that social realities and physical realities, they interact in this way. And Hyland gives this great example, mood swings and asthma.
Okay.
So mood swings might increase the risk of having an asthma attack, but then having an asthma attack can make you more likely to have mood swings.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It's this constant interplay, and our simple models of SES, they often miss this.
Yeah, they don't capture that complexity. So given all of this, all these challenges with SES, what are some of the ways that researchers are trying to get a better handle on it?
Well, one of the earlier attempts, and the source mentions this, was by Chambers in 1986. He tried to figure out causality by looking at how much the ranges of different variables overlapped.
Okay.
It was a clever idea, but it was really more of an indirect way of doing it. It didn't really give you a number, like how much is one thing causing the other.
So more of a starting point than a solution?
Yeah, I think so. A more direct approach, and one that's used a lot more, is to do longitudinal studies.
Right. That makes sense.
So these studies follow the same people over time, which lets researchers measure things that might be causes before they measure SES and other outcomes.
Right. So you can actually see what comes first.
Exactly. And the source talks about this really cool study by Cassidy and Lynn back in 1991. They measured all kinds of things in 16-year-olds.
Okay.
Things like their intelligence, how motivated they were to achieve things, how much encouragement they got from their parents, even their personality traits.
Wow, okay.
And then they tracked these same kids until they were 23 and looked at their SES and their academic achievement.
Interesting.
And what they found was that a lot of those things they measured at age 16, they actually had a big influence on the kids' SES levels at age 23. And achievement motivation and some personality factors like being outgoing and emotionally stable, those were especially strong predictors.
So they could kind of see ahead of time who was more likely to have higher SES later on.
Exactly. And here's the really interesting part. They found that when they took all those things into account, all those things they measured at 16, achievement motivation was actually a more important cause of academic achievement than SES.
Wow, so the motivation was more important than the family's socioeconomic status.
It was. And this really supports that idea we talked about earlier, that it's often those deeper underlying traits that are really driving things, not just SES itself.
Okay, that's fascinating. So by looking at things before SES came into play, they got a much clearer picture of what was really going on.
They did. And then there's another study by Gortmaker and his colleagues in '93 that took a similar approach.
Okay.
They looked at young adults and how things like their self-esteem and whether they were married in 1979 impacted their SES in 1988. And they even found that being overweight in 1979 was linked to lower income, lower education, and more poverty 9 years later.
Wow, okay.
Although, interestingly, they didn't find a link with lower self-esteem.
Hmm.
But these longitudinal studies, they really give us a much better understanding of how things unfold over time.
Great. You can see those patterns.
Exactly.
So it seems like measuring things over time is crucial for figuring this stuff out. What about using earlier measures of SES itself, especially when we're talking about divorce?
Yeah, this is another really important approach. And the reasoning here is exactly what we discussed before. Since divorce often causes a drop in income, using an SES measure that was taken before the divorce can give us a more accurate picture of how the divorce is impacting things like academic achievement.
Right. So instead of looking at the family's, potentially lower SES after the divorce, you look at it before everything changed.
Exactly. And this is something that Allison and Furstenberg have talked about, and Sherlin and his colleagues as well. And Janes himself, he actually used this approach in a 1998 study using the National Educational Longitudinal Study data. He looked at families who divorced between 88 and 92, and he used their SES levels from before the divorce happened,
Okay.
what they call pre-dissolution SES.
Right, right.
And what he found was that using this earlier SES measure actually showed a bigger impact of divorce on academic achievement.
Oh, interesting. That seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So why would using an earlier measure of SES show a bigger effect?
Yeah.
Well, here's the thinking. Families with lower SES are actually a little more likely to get divorced in the first place.
Okay.
So if you're controlling for SES after the divorce, you're basically hiding some of the negative effects of the divorce itself.
Oh, I see.
You're attributing them to the already lower SES.
Right.
But by using the SES from before the divorce, you're getting a clearer sense of the extra harm that the divorce itself is doing,
Okay, that makes sense.
above and beyond their initial SES level. And this is why Janes argues that those post-divorce SES measures, they're actually underestimating the true impact of divorce.
Right, because they're sort of mixing those two things together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this actually suggests that some older studies that found that divorce didn't really hurt kids academically, those findings might have been influenced by how they were controlling for SES.
Interesting.
Yeah, the source mentions Aycock and Kiecolt, Bain and Jargowski, and Svanum and others who all did research in the 70s and 80s and found that divorce didn't have much of a negative impact on kids' school performance.
Mm-hmm.
And the suggestion is that maybe they were using these post-divorce SES controls, which could have skewed their results.
Okay, so the timing of those measurements is super important.
It is.
Yeah. So what are some other ways that researchers are trying to address this?
Well, there's this other really interesting approach that involves studying twins.
Twins. Okay.
Yeah, and specifically identical twins who were raised either together or apart.
All right.
So Lichtenstein and his colleagues, they did this back in '92, and they were trying to separate the effects of SES from the things that might be causing it.
I see.
Kind of like the whole nature versus nurture debate.
Right, right.
So by comparing twins who had different upbringings and different SES levels, they could get a better idea of how much genetics, shared environment, and individual experiences were contributing to both SES and other things.
Right.
Now, they were careful to point out that family SES can definitely influence those causal factors,
Of course. Yeah.
and that things about the parents can affect both their kids' traits and how well they do.
Uh,
But their study showed that childhood experiences do have a big impact on SES later in life.
okay.
So it's like using this natural experiment to kind of tease apart these really complex relationships.
Right, because you've got that built-in control group with the twins.
Exactly. And then there's this other approach that involves looking at what are called intervening variables. So Sobel, back in 91, he argued that if we really want to understand how SES is connected to things like obesity, we need to figure out what the links are.
The mechanisms, yeah.
Yeah, the mechanism. So instead of just saying, SCS causes obesity, we need to look at how it does that.
Right.
What are the steps in between?
Exactly.
So Sobel said, when we're thinking about how SCS affects obesity, we should be looking at things like people's eating habits, how much they exercise, their metabolism, how much energy they burn.
Okay.
And when we're thinking about how obesity might affect SCS, we need to look at things like how obesity is perceived, prejudice, bias, stigma, discrimination.
Right. All the social factors that come into play.
Exactly. And by including these intervening variables in our research, we can get a much more detailed picture of how SES is actually working.
It's like you're opening up the black box.
Exactly.
Instead of just looking at the inputs and outputs, you're looking at what's happening inside. And finally, the source talks about using more complex statistical methods, things like two-stage least squares analysis, which Edelman and his colleagues used in 1990 to look at the reciprocal effects of SES and health.
All right.
So these are more advanced techniques that try to untangle cause and effect when you think two things are influencing each other at the same time, like SES and health.
Exactly. But even with these fancy statistical tools, it's still really tough to be absolutely sure about causality when it comes to these complex social things.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
It is.
It sounds like there's no magic bullet here, but there are a lot of different approaches that are being developed to deal with this whole issue of SES.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So where does this all leave us? What's the takeaway?
Well, I think the main thing is that controlling for SES, it's not just this simple statistical thing you do.
Right.
It's actually really complex.
Yeah.
And the ways we usually do it, they can be too simplistic.
Mm-hmm.
And they often don't really address this question of cause and effect in a nuanced way.